Every month, have been doing this for more than 5 years. We started out at Barnes & Noble. Maybe some of you have been with us before. Kurt Armbruster, our speaker tonight, has been with us before with a musical program. I am a volunteer, and we would, and I want to introduce also Edie Newsom, who is a volunteer and is my assistant and has been just recently started helping me find authors or speakers in the community. And so if you guys have suggestions, Edie or I are the ones to talk to. We contact them and make arrangements for this evening. Second Thursday of every month, and we'll continue here with the library. They've been willing to set this evening aside for us here. I also, excuse me, I'm going to go on and mention our new volunteer, Chuck, who has a video camera tonight because there was a little mess up, and I have all the rest of the equipment, the video equipment, but not the camera. So he has the camera, and he's taping this for us. It will be available on our website later. So be sure and check that out if you like, and use it for other purposes. If you want to show a spouse or your kids or your grandkids or whatever, that's a good way to do it. That would be on www.loghousemuseum.org. I also want to mention membership into the Historical Society, and we have those forms with us tonight. I'm going to hand these around. If you're interested, take one and pass the rest of them around. I'm also going to pass around a sheet for you to sign up on if you would like to receive emails about our activities. It's not just our activities, but a lot of the activities of the all of the activities of the Historical Society, ours and others. And some of you are already on the list. I always like to ask kind of informally also how you found out about us tonight. Now I know some of you are probably Kurt's groupies, I don't know. And a lot of men were here, came in early, and other people have helped us set up chairs to get this ready for this crowd. But how many of you heard about it through our own mailing system, through the Historical Societies? That's a good third of you at least, yeah, something like that. How many of you heard about it on the West Seattle blog? Okay, and where are the, how'd you hear about it? Through the
library.
Of course.
That's the biggie, yeah. You guys all get a raise too. My husband is a smart aleck. Well, we're glad to have you here for whatever reason. Stay tuned. You have a chair picked out, Marcy?
I'm good.
All right.
Thanks.
All right. Well, without any further ado, I would like to introduce Kurt. Kurt, I told you, is a former presenter for Words Writers in West Seattle. He presented the book Before Seattle Rocked, A City and Its Music. I forget what month it was, and I didn't look it up. Do you remember, Kurt?
It was about a year or two ago now.
Okay, yeah. I think we're into our 6th year, because I joined as a volunteer the Historical Society and got this job shortly thereafter. And I'm on the board now too. So I have all of those records, and so does our video library have most, I think, if not all of those videos. So check it out sometime. So Kurt is a Seattle native, historian, author, and musician-songwriter. He and his wife Cedar live in Seattle. He is a member of the Musicians Union of Seattle, Local 76-493, and plays in a band. Kurt is a graduate of the University of Washington with a BA in history, has written numerous articles for historical journals and a handful of books, including Orphan Road, The Road Comes to Seattle, The Pacific, that's this one, sorry. And he wrote Playing for Change, Burton and Florence James, and The Struggle for American Theater, about the founders of the Seattle Repertory Playhouse. Kurt is on Facebook, I looked you up, Kurt, and has a short fiction blog called extranocredit.com. Tonight he's presenting Pacific Coast, Seattle's own railroad, recently re-released by the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive. And you'll hear more about that organization Gary is here and brought the books to sell tonight. The history of the story here is that as the reigning seaport on Puget Sound, Seattle had high hopes that the Northern Pacific Railroad would make the city its western terminus. Instead, the railroad chose Tacoma. In Seattle, panic gave way to resolution as the citizens rolled up their sleeves and built their own railroad. Here is the first story of the colorful pioneer enterprise that helped build the Pacific Northwest greatest city. Please help me welcome Kurt back to Words, Writers in West Seattle.
Thanks very much, Dorothy, and the Southwest Seattle Historical Society. Wonderful group, a real treasure for our community.
Thank you.
Well, as a kid, I got it hooked by trains and railroading early on. I'll try to make this work properly. Okay.
Just hit the left arrow.
John, would you like a drink of water? I'll get one for Kurt.
Okay. Excuse me 1 second. It's not even going up to next. Isn't that funny? Okay. Anyway, as a kid in the 50s, that wasn't difficult given the plethora of colorful railroad action in Seattle. My dad took that picture in 1955. That was the visit to the roundhouse that got me hooked, and I've never turned back since. Well, other people, well, I'll tell you this. I got interested in maps. I like to sit with a Washington State map and look at the various railroad lines. How many of you did that as a kid? Trace the railroad lines and see where they went? So I got intimately familiar with the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern and Milwaukee, the big cross-country railroads. Then one day I was looking at the map and I saw this little red line. It's about 1/4 of an inch long. It said Pacific Coast Railroad. What the heck is that? Well, no, it doesn't go from Vancouver to San Diego. Other people have different experiences. You might have been driving through Renton in the late 1940s and come face to face with this apparition out of the past. An antique steam engine pulling a line of battered freight cars. Meet the Pacific Coast Railroad. Small, no more than 40-odd miles long at its greatest extent. Dingy, rickety, nondescript, no passenger expresses, no hotshot freights. However, this little nondescript railroad is one of the main factors that made Seattle what it is today. The Pacific Coast began in 1873 as the Seattle and Walla Walla and went through 3 changes in its career. Well, as many of you probably know, Seattle was born in 1851 on Alki Point. Okay, let's get this out of the way. How many say Alki? How many say Alki? You're all right. By people from the Midwest who uprooted themselves and made the arduous cross-country wagon journey in hopes of founding a city. Said town founder Arthur Denny. Well, they founded that city in large part due to the assumption that they would have a railroad to the rest of the country. Otherwise, this would have been hopelessly out of the way. Said Arthur Denny, I came to this coast with the belief that a railroad would be built across the continent to some point on the northern coast within the next 15 or 20 years, and located on the Sound with that expectation. Well, the hopes of Denny and his neighbors appeared vindicated only 2 years later, 1853, when a large surveying party led by Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens conducted the Northern Pacific Railroad Expedition and Survey from roughly St. Paul across the northern United States, scouting out a route to Puget Sound from the Midwest. This is one of several Pacific Railroad surveys that Congress had funded at that time to choose a route for a new railroad. You had the southern route, the central route, another route, and the northern Pacific route. Here they are in the field. Isaac Stevens, the man in the hat there, short fellow. How'd you like to ride 2,000 miles in buckskin clothing, eating hard bread and tinned beef with a hernia? Well, that's what he did. Sounds like fun, huh? Said Isaac Stevens, the northern route was best, and Seattle, as its western terminus, combines the greatest number of advantages. Well, it wasn't going to be quite that simple. The Northern Railroad would be a long time coming. Seattle's first 2 decades were tough times. Settlers were starting to gravitate to the Pacific Northwest, but conflict with Native American inhabitants, frequent economic slumps, and the turmoil of Civil War all kept growth down. But
Where's
Seattle
that
was
picture
lucky.
from?
Yes,
Where's
ma'am.
that? Is
This?
that downtown? Where?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. That's Front Street, Seattle, about 1860.
That'd be
65.
nice to identify, very interesting.
Yes, yes. That's looking up towards First Hill.
Thank you.
Yes. And, well, Seattle was lucky. Right off the bat, Seattle had luck in her corner because she had one thing that everybody wanted: coal. Coal was black gold, powered factories and steamships, heated homes, if you were lucky, if you had the money to buy a coal furnace. But coal was down there. And it was very arduous, expensive process to get it out and transport it to market. Small-scale mining began in the foothills east of Lake Washington in the 1860s. And in February 1870, Seattle businessmen formed the Seattle Coal Company and the Seattle Coal and Transportation Company to expand the coal mining operations. From the mine at Newcastle, horses trundled coal cars along a 3-mile tramway to the east shore of Lake Washington. From there, it was barged 7.5 miles up to Montlake Cut. It had to be taken off the barge, moved across that little narrow tongue of land, put back on a barge to cross Portage Bay and Lake Union, and then put back on cars to haul down Westlake Avenue and Pike Street to the waterfront,
Wow.
where it was dumped in a bunker at the foot of the hill and then skiffed out to sailing ships. Very labor-intensive, inefficient process. There's a map of the route. Well, they made a great step forward in 1871 when the sailing ship delivered this, the very first steam locomotive to run on Puget Sound. It acquired the nickname Ant, weighed 7 tons, and in March of 1872, all the people of Seattle turned out to get free rides and have all kinds of fun with their new toy. And this hauled the coal cars from the foot of Pike Street to Lake Union. And then it was also put on the Newcastle end to replace the horses. While the Seattle coal and transportation system was steadily upgraded, this is perhaps the most notable feature. This is a very rare photograph. 900-foot-long cable incline on the east side of Lake Washington. This opened in 1874. It was operated by gravity. Newcastle was up here in the hills, 3 miles away. They brought the cars down, and one by one they hooked them up to a cable, lowered it down. A man at the top operated a brake drum to keep it under control.
Wow.
The motion of the loaded car coming down raised an empty car going up, counterbalance. And they met right here in the middle so they could go around each other. It worked very well. They only had 1 or 2 runaways, and it was in operation in about 3 years. So that's how they did that. And they could make, it's been estimated, 3 round trips a day by barge, and they were saying they could bring out 300 tons of coal a day. It was remarkably efficient for little coal cars and primitive equipment. In Seattle, they built this bunker here. Thousand-ton bunker capacity. Here's the foot of Pike Street. Again, they cabled the coal cars down this incline, probably with another man with a drum. And they had to haul the coal way out the pier. We don't know how they did that. Probably used a steam donkey, a stationary steam engine with a cable attached to bring the cars out. Here you see the SS Dakota side-wheeler loading coal as fuel for its run up and down the Pacific coast. It was one of the largest, possibly the largest steamship at the time. On the other side is a sailing ship loading coal for San Francisco. This was part of a fleet of several sailing ships that were contracted to haul Seattle coal. It was a conveyor belt, and it really got Seattle going. Without this operation, without this first little railroad between Newcastle in stages to Seattle, who knows what we would have become. In 1874, another coal mine opened in Renton, and a railroad was built from it out to the Duwamish River. And so coal started moving from Renton down the Duwamish to Seattle as well. Coal was really taking off, and it was stimulating Seattle's growth. New industries were cropping up. New folks were moving in. Seattle and King County were starting to boom. Well, all this was great, but it still wasn't a transcontinental railroad. That's what we really wanted. In 1870, things looked promising when the Northern Pacific Railroad, incorporated in 1864, chartered by Abraham Lincoln, finally drove its first spike in Minnesota, destination Puget Sound. This prompted a fresh wave of migration to the Pacific Northwest and ignited hope in Seattle. However, in July of 1873 came word that the Northern Pacific would terminate in Tacoma. Seattle tore its hair and gnashed its teeth. They held town meetings. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? A man got up. Here's what we're going to do. How many people have ever heard of him? Sir Lucius Garfield, one of the most important figures in early Seattle. Because it was Mr. Garfield who says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to build our own railroad. We're going to build it to Walla Walla. Why Walla Walla? Territory's largest city. sort of the gateway to the east. Railroads were coming towards Walla Walla to tap into the Palouse grain country. So we could hook up there and make our own transcontinental railroad.
Wow.
It's only 200 miles. It's just one little mountain range between Seattle. You know, well, make it a narrow gauge railroad for one thing, save money, more economical to build. You can sell construction bonds. All you people should pitch in and buy your construction bonds, and those of you who live adjacent to the projected route would be happy to donate land to the new railroad. Well, in this way, Seattle incorporated the Seattle and Walla Walla. One of the lead incorporators, Arthur Denny, in July 1873, just days after the dread Northern Pacific announcement.
Wow.
Seattle was off to the races. And down on the Duwamish Flats, on the east side of the Duwamish Valley, Seattleites, 1,200 of them, all pitched in to start building on May 1st, 1874. They built 1 mile, they graded out 1 mile of roadbed in that day. Everybody felt great, and they signed pledges to buy bonds, and by October, several miles had been graded down the Duwamish Valley towards the new railroad from the Renton coal mine. Well, that was a great start, but how far do you get with 1,200 volunteer laborers and a treasury which people at the time said, we knew where every silver dollar in town was located. Cash poor. This was still hard times. Well, thankfully, we had this chap. James M. Coleman. Coleman Dock, Coleman Park. Scottish mill engineer. Came here, I believe, in 1861. Brilliant man. And he guaranteed the Seattle and Walla Walla bonds as much upwards of $60,000 if his fellow Seattleites would contribute, would pitch in, and they did enough for him to complete the Seattle and Walla Walla to the Duwamish Valley in 1877, using white and Chinese laborers. It's about 9 miles of railroad. They hooked up with the Renton coal mine line, and in 1877, the first train ran. They used this trestle. Here's the coal bunker, the new coal bunker in King Street. They came in on this long pile trestle across the tide flats.
Is that West Seattle that you're looking at over there?
No, ma'am,
No.
West Seattle would be to the right, off
right.
the picture, yes.
Okay.
Pioneers Quarter.
Beacon Hill.
Yes,
Okay.
this is looking southeast toward Beacon Hill.
Okay.
Here's the trestle again in the King Street terminal, dating again from about 1877, 1878. Here's the coal bunker, little engine shoving the loaded coal cars up. They were drop bottom 2-ton coal cars. Just open the bottoms and the coal would fall into the bunkers. It's very efficient.
That'd be a ton of coal dust in your lungs.
Yes, it is. Yes. Well, in 1878, the branch line was extended from Renton to Newcastle. It was James M. Coleman's belief that we may not have a transcontinental railroad, but if we can make it to the Renton coal mine and up to Newcastle, the Seattle and Walla Walla will pay for itself. And it did.
Wow.
Here's the pride of Seattle, engine number 1, which was actually bought secondhand from a California railroad, but it's virtually brand new in this picture. It was hauled up here by ship and assembled here. It was hauled up in roughly kit form and given the name Arthur Denny. But it was a beautiful little machine, and it was put to use first on special trains to Meadows Racetrack, which is where Boeing Field is today. Very popular pastime. All those cars were built in Seattle. This is another point of pride. Built here and they had just begun to cast the metal parts as well. So all the trucks and the wheels and other metal castings were also made here. This was a major thing. Already, Seattle was starting to get a swollen head. And well, she might. For just as Sir Lucius Garfield had predicted, the world was starting to take notice of Seattle's pluck and energy. Big money was starting to take notice. New York money. What was Seattle called when people stayed first, white people first? Thank you. We very modestly helped ourselves to the name New York. And of course, visitors soon started ridiculing us, saying New York alki, New York by and by. Well, okay, we'll take that bet. Here comes this fellow, the reigning wizard of Wall Street. 1880, comes to Seattle, looks the Newcastle mine and the Seattle and Walla Walla over, snaps him up for $750,000. Puts him in his new grand empire, the Oregon Improvement Company, new holding company, promises Seattle big things. He's going to build us a connection with the Northern Pacific from Tacoma into the Cascade Mountains. This line is built between 1880 and 1884. They joined up just south of present-day Auburn, and in 1884, Seattle got its first mainline train connection. Here's one of their engines on the Seattle waterfront. This was the new Puget Sound Shore Railroad, formed by the Villard Companies in 1880, although it was incorporated in the early 1880s. Henry Villard's, the Improvement Company also built a new line from Renton out to Black Diamond. They just opened coal mines out there with an even higher grade of coal than at Newcastle. Very promising. And that line was finished in 1885. So this was already adding to Seattle's newfound wealth. This is 30 years after Seattle's founding. What did Arthur Denny say? We came to the coast within 15 or 20 years. That's not bad. Well, Henry Villard was a local hero. He came out in 1883 when he drove the last spike in the Northern Pacific Railroad, was given a hero's welcome.
Where is that at?
This is the first territorial university in Seattle,
Wow.
right
Downtown?
downtown. Yes, right downtown.
Ah.
Seattle really boomed. Population doubled between 1880 and 1890. Well, Henry Villard is a controversial figure. To this day, some dismiss him as just another robber baron who fleeced widows and orphans. I don't think so. I think he was very well intentioned. He was not mendacious, but I like to say his financial eyes were bigger than his stomach. He didn't know really the dangers of high finance, and it all came too easily for him. So his financial house of cards collapsed at the end of 1883. And there came a recession. The coal business kept going, though, because it was in such demand. So Seattle came through it a little better than many places. But in 1893, there came the terrible national depression, the Panic of '93, and that really hit everybody hard. By that time, the Seattle Railroad, which had been bought by Henry Villard in 1880 and renamed Columbia and Puget Sound, grand sounding name. It was having hard times. It was always kind of a shoestring operation, even though it was founded by big New York money. It was kind of leveraged. His holdings were all kind of on a shoestring. So they started having explosions in the mines and fires, and this became a time of great labor unrest as well. So we're getting into turbulent times in the not-so-gay 90s. In 1897, the narrow gauge Columbia and Puget Sound Railroad was finally converted to standard gauge. So you see the old, already little Arthur Denny engine here, the narrow gauge, already fading into history. The shiny new heavy locomotives of the standard gauge ready to take over. Well, by this time, it had become apparent that Seattle's railroad facilities had become woefully inadequate.
So where is that?
This is on the water, this is taken from Beacon Hill, looking north across Seattle towards Elliott Bay. West Seattle is down here. This is all tide
The tide
flats.
flats, yeah.
And this they had begun filling in the 1890s, and they didn't finish it really until the 1930s. There was still open water in places until the 1930s. Here is the old Seattle and Walla Walla route, going around the shore of Beacon Hill, out to the coal bunker. There, same coal bunkers. But this is where the standard gauge line came in from the south. This is what they called the broad gauge strip. Just open storage for freight, one modest sized warehouse. The little frame passenger station was up here. All pretty chaotic and rapidly outmoded. So at the time, city engineers and the Great Northern Railway's president, James J. Hill, really put their foot down and said, we're gonna have something new. So they did. To make a long story short, yes. And a new era
And the
opened.
union.
Yes.
Yep.
And so the Pacific Coast, now the Columbia and Puget Sound got a new terminus, new coal bunkers, electrically operated, state-of-the-art, new engine house at the foot of Dearborn Street. Here's a map of the new and the old. Here's the King Street Station as it is today. Here's their coal bunker, engine house and terminal. Here are the main yards that came into existence after 1903. The old routes here.
And that rail's still there, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Well, a big development came in 1906 when the big Chicago, Milwaukee, and Puget Sound Railroad announced that it was coming to Puget Sound, and it started building out here from South Dakota. It needed a way, it was gonna come over Snoqualmie Pass. Well, it needed a way to get into Seattle. Well, right in its path was the little Columbia and Puget Sound. So they signed a 99-year lease. The giant Milwaukee became a tenant of the little Columbia and Puget Sound. Good deal.
Yeah.
Well, they not only got track rent, but they got double track. Milwaukee wanted double track. They wanted heavy, modern rail instead of the spindly, old-fashioned rail. They wanted block signals, of all things. It really hit the big time on this new double track railroad. And between 1920 and 1927, they added electric power. The Milwaukee became the world's longest electrified railroad for many years. It was a major inspiration for the Italian railroad system's electrification. All through this, coal kept marching on. Coal hit its height during the World War I era. Did good business. The Seattle Railroad was busy, busy, busy. And here you see what it took. This is at Coal Creek, which is 2 miles east of Newcastle. Looking at the shift change. Behind the photographer is the entrance to the Bagley mine. This was the zenith of coal mining in this area. But already coal was in twilight. Our local coal was being eclipsed by Rocky Mountain and Roslyn coal from the east, but more especially by fuel oil. By 1920, fuel oil was really taking over, and of course electricity was as well. So coal was really in decline. One by one, they started trimming back the old branch lines of the former Seattle and Walla Walla, which had become the Columbia Puget Sound. And in 1916, it was finally renamed the Pacific Coast Railroad. See, in 1896, the Oregon Improvement Company went bankrupt, and it was acquired by a new company, the Pacific Coast Company.
And
Pacific
those are
Coast-
real companies to the west of the mountains that you're talking about?
That's
At
right,
this point,
yes.
trying to come into the eastern portion?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So Pacific Coast Company was a big outfit. It operated steamships, a railroad in California, and our little railroad here, and coal mining and other industries. Well, by 1948, coal had declined so much that trains like this to Black Diamond were down to about twice a week. The railroad was considering abandonment, but it wanted to find a buyer. There was a certain amount of sentiment in the railroad that they wanted to keep it going. Hopefully inclusion within a larger system would allow them to do that. You might think that Milwaukee would have bought them, but they sort of hemmed and hawed, thinking nobody else would be interested. Well, in stepped the Great Northern, and they snapped up the Pacific Coast Railroad for $1,700,000 in 1951. They were going to modernize and bring it up to date, and they had good reason, because Pacific Coast, here's one of their old cars. Great Northern retired their old rolling stock. First order of business was to add diesel power to get rid of the old steam power. So they had to strengthen this bridge at Maple Valley over the Cedar River. And then they brought in the new diesels.
Now, are those all freight cars at that time, no
Yes,
passenger?
that's right. And they were able to retire the faithful old steam engines. And they built new depots in Renton and Maple Valley. Here's a typical Pacific Coast Line train from the 1950s coming west through Renton, down the main drag from Black Diamond. Those are all coal cars, full of coal from Black Diamond. He's going to, that coal is going to the University of Washington steam plant. Remember that? Big tall stack with white smoke. The Tacoma Indian Hospital, and there were one or two other major users even into the 1960s that were still buying coal from Black Diamond.
Wow.
But downtown Renton was really where the real action was. This is why Great Northern bought the Pacific Coast Railroad, because downtown Renton had the Boeing Company, PACCAR, and General Motors reloading area. So they kept busy. Pacific Coast, this was the main focus now. This local freight train out of Seattle would leave Seattle in the morning and spend the day working around Renton, switching cars. And the crews started calling them the Renton Rocket. But nobody wanted to. It was not a very well liked job. You were out there all day, and it was tedious. And that sort of thing. But here's the layout at Renton.
Wow.
Very compact and very lucrative. The Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive has all the annual reports of the Pacific Coast Railroad. And they showed a consistent profit. Sometimes it was modest, but they did make a profit, even in hard times. And the line remains active today, still short, insignificant, appearing, and yet a major part of our regional transportation system. Well, let's take a ride on the Pacific Coast Railroad in its heyday. We can do that thanks to two men. James A. Turner, a Seattle streetcar conductor, who on his days off would pack his big view camera and tripod, didn't have a car. He would ride a train out to who knows where, set up and take pictures of trains. Well, who else was doing that in the 1920s and 30s? Not very many people.
Wow.
Here he is in the 1940s, taken by his friend Harold Hill, who took even more train pictures, and we're in their debt for these images to follow. Going on duty at Seattle in December 1947. On the right, Tom Wilchning, who I was fortunate to interview for this book. He's getting ready to spend the day out switching the yards near the old Sears building in Seattle.
Wow. And a chalkboard.
Yes, they're signing on duty. This is New Year's Eve, 1947. New Year's Eve morning. This is early morning. And on the right is senior engineer Fritz Soderback, ready to sign on for another run to Black Diamond. Here's Tom hustling out the old number 12 to switch the yards. In the back is the engine house that we saw earlier. Now let me add, I interviewed 3 men, former employees, and they love the Pacific Coast Railroad. They loved their work. The Great Northern might have owned the railroad, but the Pacific Coast remained independent in its operations. And it carried on really much as it had until 1970. In 1970, it and the Great Northern became part of the new Burlington Northern system. And the last train to Black Diamond ran in September 1970. Here's the big yard in Seattle.
Wow.
Their engine terminal was up here. And here's their yard. Here's the coal cars getting ready to go back to Black Diamond. Over here is Northern Pacific's freight yard. And here is the Milwaukee engine terminal here. Very busy place.
That's a lot of rail
Is
lines.
that Auburn?
That's Seattle.
Seattle Station, yeah. Is that taken from the Sears building?
Yes, yes,
Kurt, another question?
yes,
Is that the current, like, Stacy Street?
yes.
station?
Still very active today. Now, Columbia and Puget Sound, Pacific Coast did run passenger trains. This is their 1907 timetable. And it's pretty good, pretty extensive. This is the high point. They ran trains to Newcastle and Black Diamond and Franklin and up to Taylor. This is their terminus at the foot of Washington Street in Seattle, looking west onto Elliott Bay. And you see the Pacific Coast Company's piers A through D. And a typical little 2-car passenger train about to leave for probably Black Diamond or possibly Newcastle.
Kurt, any idea what those tickets cost at that time?
Oh, 50 cents maybe? Yeah. Here's a train at the same depot, taken about 1920. This is their This was their fancy engine.
High speed.
Yeah. It was probably clean when it left the factory.
Wow.
That was it. Here comes a freight out of Seattle heading for Black Diamond. Empty coal cars. This was taken by James Turner in the 1930s. Depths of depression, but there's still enough demand for coal that they kept going. One of the hallmarks of the Pacific Coast Railroad was the contrast between those little rickety steam trains and the Milwaukee's electric streamliners.
I can't imagine electricity being able to pull that much weight.
Oh, yes, yes.
Wow.
It's a very efficient mode of power. Allentown, how many remember the old Allentown covered bridge? Yeah, yeah. That was a landmark. It was sadly burned in 1959. I guess the story I heard from Warren Wing was that a bunch of kids were playing with matches and where the photographer's standing is basically where the Interstate 5 overpass is today. Just a few miles south of that, all the railroad lines coming into Seattle from the south converged at Black River Junction. This was near the old meeting place of the Renton Coal Mine and the Seattle and Walla Walla Railroad way back in the 1870s. Still that major transportation artery that was founded on May 1st, 1874. And he's making the bend there to head on into Renton. Here's the old Renton Depot, shared with the Milwaukee Road. Men on the front of the engine getting ready to hop off to do their switching of cars. There's a small railroad yard off behind that sign there, and they would set off cars there and do their switching at their industries in Renton. Then they'd have their lunch, in railroad speak, go to Beans. And then they'd get back on the engine and head up to Black Diamond. Here's Fritz Soderback again, meeting a westbound Milwaukee electric-powered freight train at the depot. This was taken in the 1940s. And from Renton, the Newcastle branch took off to the north. In about 1915, the Pacific Coast Company established a charcoal briquette factory in North Renton, which they called Briquetteville. And for a number of years, they did fair business. They were in big demand for use in charcoal heaters for orchards. And they did well, but the Depression pretty well killed it off, and it shut down in the 1930s. Near there was a big log dump that the Pacific Coast brought down logs from the Taylor branch. We'll see more of that. And they would dump those into the lake and raft them up to the big sawmills in Ballard. I remember we lived on Mercer Island by the East Channel, and I remember still seeing in the 1960s those big long rafts of logs going to the Ballard Mills. Well, the Newcastle branch was a tough bit of railroad. It was only 6 miles long, but it was twisty, turny. The ground was soft. In the winter, it would slough off. And they had this enormous ravine to cross. So they built a curved trestle over this May Creek ravine, and they had to replace it twice. The original trestle dating from 1878. Then in the 1890s, it was modified as a standard gauge trestle that's the curved trestle on the left. And then in 1910, they replaced it with a straight trestle. All those structures were said to be the largest timber trestles west of St. Louis. And here's the mine at Newcastle. the car is being lowered back into the mine, which is down out of the picture there. Up at the left is the sorting shed for sorting out the various grades of coal. And they would be dumped there into the railroad cars to take the railroad out. You can still see some of the mine heads at Newcastle today. The Newcastle Historical Society is attempting to preserve them. There's some possibility of the whole area being redeveloped as a golf course. That would really wipe out an important bit of local history. 2 miles east of Newcastle is Coal Creek, which in the 1880s began to supplant the Newcastle mines. And they really outclassed Newcastle for a number of years. Then they had a fire about 1894. Newcastle had a revival, and both sites remained busy into the 1920s. But then in 1929, a big fire destroyed much of the Coal Creek mine, and that was the end of the mining in the Newcastle area, except you had a few small independent so-called gyppo miners keep coal mining going in Newcastle into the early 1960s.
Was that a fire in the mine or in this area?
It was
that
on
we're
the
looking at?
structures up on the surface, yes, the coal bunkers and.
That must
yeah.
have been an inferno.
It was, and by then it was such a marginal operation anyway that they just shut it all down.
Wow.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite old pictures. This shows what it was really like railroading in the 1880s and 90s. Primitive equipment, 10, 12-hour days, 6 days a week. Engineers, locomotive engineers, like this gent. I forget his name, it's in the book. $3 an hour, not bad. Brakeman, like the kid here with his brake club to wind up the handbrakes. Imagine doing that 10 hours a day in the rain. $1.50 an hour, a day. $1.50 a day.
That was good money, right?
Well, $3 a day was good money. $1.50 a day, you didn't get rich on it, but hard work, thankless work, and yet, look at those faces. They were proud of their work, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They were building a community. Now here's a typical modern day Pacific Coast train heading up to Black Diamond on the main street of Renton. Here's our modern day brakeman, Pete Lopez. Doesn't have to use a brake club anymore, but he does have to watch out and shoo cars away from the train. Did that all the time, yeah. 20 years before that, another Black Diamond train heading up the Cedar River. There's the fellow on the front, the brakeman, looking for rocks on the track and ready to hop off and perform switching moves if necessary. Maple Valley, first depot, circa 1890, built by the Columbia and Puget Sound on the new Black Diamond branch.
Can you tell us how fast those trains ran?
Usually no more than about 25. They had little wheels, they just couldn't go fast, and you wouldn't want to because they would ride so rough, horribly rough riding.
Yeah.
They weren't built for speed, they were built to lug
Heavy
tonnage,
stuff.
that's right. Here's Maple Valley again, here's the same depot. Looking south, up toward the Cedar River trestle. You saw a picture of that earlier being modernized. Looking up the hill towards Lake Wilderness, and the Black Diamond is about 7.5 miles further on. Here's operator Hugh O'Neill handing up train orders to the engineer on the Black Diamond train at the second Maple Valley Depot, built in 1911. Who's that? Thank you. In the 1890s, Arthur Denny and company opened a new clay and coal mine at a little place east of Maple Valley. So they extended the railroad up there, and they named the station Taylor. And it went through Hobart. And in time, it became a major center of new traffic for the Columbia, Puget Sound, and Pacific Coast Railroads. This is the Denny Renton Clay Company, later Gladding McBean, one of the country's largest manufacturers of terracotta and porcelain products, building materials, and conduit, sewer pipes.
Coal-fired.
Yes.
Look at that smoke.
Oh, yes.
Whoa.
Yep. That remained in operation into the 1930s, but at that time, the city of Seattle became concerned about the operation polluting the groundwater there. This was tributary to the Cedar River watershed, which was Seattle's primary source of fresh water. So they began working to clear the area out completely. They wanted to condemn it and move all habitation and industry out and close it off. And that happened in the late 1940s. The final runs on the Maple Valley branch to Taylor took place in 1944. Harold Hill followed a train up to Taylor one day. This is in the 1940s, leaving Maple Valley. Short little train of boxcars, probably going up to that clay and Gladding McBean plant to pick up some freight to go out. Passing the Peacock home at Hobart. Here it is today. Here's where the railroad ran right down.
Wow.
Yep. Dick Peacock is president of the Maple Valley Historical Society.
See, the trees grew back.
Oh, yes. Here he is arriving at Taylor. The other source of traffic on the Taylor branch was logs, lumber. There was a huge lumber mill at Hobart, Wood and Iverson. And for many years, they did a big business shipping out finished lumber in boxcars. And there was another sawmill nearby that shipped out unfinished logs. And these came down to Renton and went into the dump there at Renton. So here comes what one of the gentlemen told me he thought was possibly the last run of logs on the Pacific Coast Railroad in 1939. By that time, the logging business had really declined as well.
Why?
Depression,
Ran out of trees.
you know, and, thank you, yes, it got logged off, so there just wasn't material anymore. And now we go south from Maple Valley to Black Diamond, on the Black Diamond branch. Gotta put water in the tender before you head up. It's a 1.38% grade. So here's our old friend Fritz Soderback, who was senior engineer. None of the other men really liked him that much. They said he was not a very good engineer and difficult to work with, but it was his seniority, so.
Were they
that's who
union
counted.
back then?
Yep. Well, actually, let me qualify that. Pacific Coast was a non-union railroad. I don't believe they belonged to the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, but they still had seniority.
Ah.
This tank was fed by water from the Cedar River, and every now and then, they would find trout swimming around in the tank. Much to the delight of the resident anglers on the crew. So he's coming uphill now out of Maple Valley, empty coal cars, heading up toward Lake Wilderness. And there's the conductor, Joe Bow, waving from the caboose. crossing the Northern Pacific Main Line, east-west, it goes from Auburn down over the mountains to Ellensburg and Yakima, Spokane and east. Henry's was the name of that spot. There was a sawmill there that did an occasional business with the Pacific Coast, and also a notorious house of ill repute.
What are those bridges made of now at that time?
Well, that's steel
Seen that.
steel girders, yes. And this is the center of operations in Maple Valley, said to be the deepest mine of its kind in the world. Employed hundreds of men of all nationalities, Welsh, Polish, Italians, Finnish. They all had their own neighborhoods in Black Diamond and the surrounding area. And this mine remained in operation almost till 1950. Here we're loading the coal cars.
How deep was the mine?
You know, I don't know. It was, I think it was at least 1,000 feet. It was deep.
Now, is that the same vein that goes over to that town right to the west of Cleveland? What's the name of that?
Roslyn, no.
Yeah, Roslyn. 'cause they
No,
had
it's a
huge
different,
coal supply too,
yes, right.
but this wasn't part of it connect? a
No,
vein through
no.
there?
That's one of the problems of Western Washington coals. The veins are broken up.
Oh.
So they were hard to mine economically on a large scale. And the coal wasn't all that good quality to be, to
It
begin
was
with.
or was not?
It was not,
Okay.
right. Around the bend in Black Diamond is the passenger station here. Here's that little two-car train we saw in Seattle. These arrived in Black Diamond around 1920. The local sports are getting their picture taken.
So that's a passenger train, right?
Yes. Mhm.
Why the little windows up above?
Those are just transom windows, just
More light?
skylights, yes. Even by this time, the automobile had really taken over. So passenger service was in major decline as early as 1920. And common carrier passenger service on the Pacific Coast Railroad ended in 1925. 3 miles further is Franklin, another mine that prospered from the mid-1890s into the teens, but again, it followed the same trajectory as the other mines. It became increasingly uneconomical to operate, and by 1922, the Franklin operations were closed. Here's that passenger train getting ready to leave Franklin, going back to Seattle, probably taken around 1910.
Can you imagine living in one of those
Those
houses?
are workers'
Where they
houses.
got- Oh.
Yep.
You'd be having lung problems, that's for sure.
Well, the Pacific Coast Railroad was on its surface, an unprepossessing, unimpressive, grungy little operation, but it was enormously important. I wonder if we'd be here with a city if it weren't for the Pacific Coast Railroad and its ancestors. They really did. They were the Boeing, the Microsoft of their day, the first really major industry that made Seattle what it is. I want to thank King County for Culture and Newcastle, Black Diamond, Maple Valley, Newcastle Historical Societies, and the Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive for making this book possible. And thank you all for coming. I'd like to, if anyone has questions, I'll hold off for a second, but let me introduce Gary Tarbox, head curator of the Pacific Northwest Archive, to tell us a little bit about this wonderful
Well,
institution.
yes, as Kurt mentioned, this
book was made possible by a grant from the For Culture, which is the agency that distributes the hotel and motel tax money to the arts and culture. We are a culture organization. Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive is located in Buren. In fact, we're one block south of the library there. We have been there for going on 10 years now. Our mission really is to preserve the history of the railroads of the Pacific Northwest and then make it available to the general public. And we use extensive internet connection. That's our main thing, is to put photos and maps and various documents of interest up on the internet. But we're really a consortium of 5 different organizations, all nonprofits that banded together to be able to do something that no one of them could do alone because of the expense. So we have a 7,500 square foot building, a lot of good storage space, but we also have 88 volunteers that work at the archive and do the kind of sorting, scanning, cataloging, and then posting the stuff up on the internet. If you're interested in railroad, we are the place you should look at. We have regular crews. For example, this is a particular Wednesday. We happen to all be at the archive working there. In fact, I'm sitting back there talking. But we get together and work on it, and this is very addictive, by the way. We've had people that have been working on this stuff, like myself, about 16 years, I think we're going on with the crews. Of course, guys come and go, but we've got, as I say, 88 volunteers at this point, and we're looking for more because it's great fun and very productive.
So do you do all the railroad lines or just Pacific Coast?
We do all of the railroad lines that operated in the Pacific Northwest, which is Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, British Columbia, and Alaska.
So when the Northern Pacific, across the street was the Union Pacific, and when that closed, why did it close? The Brown did one to across the street from the King Street
because
station.
the Union Pacific stopped running trains and they consolidated everything into Amtrak. When Amtrak became, they took King Street Station.
Yeah.
And now, of course, the Sounder occupies most of the old Union Station.
It's beautiful.
Isn't it though? It's gorgeous.
So, anyway, I just wanted to make the thing, if you're at all interested, come forward and I'll give you a card to, I'd love to have people come out and try out our thing. And also, if you have any questions about railroads in the Pacific Northwest, don't hesitate to give us a call or write an email to us. That's all up on the internet. Just put in Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive and you'll get to our site. And then from our site, you can get to all of the other sites of the organizations that we are made up of. We have copies of the book. Oh, yes.
Well, I just have a question, and I was out of the room for a little bit, but I didn't hear the town of Leicester mentioned.
Well, Leicester's not on this line.
It's not, okay.
Leicester's on the Northern Pacific, up on the Stampede Pass line.
Okay.
As I said, this book was funded by For Culture. Interestingly enough, we're selling some tonight, but we don't, Pacific Northwest Railroad Archive doesn't own any of these books. These are all, what we did is we wrote a grant and we produced 500 copies and then gave them 100 copies each to the 4 major organizations on the east side where the railroad ran as a fundraiser. And then also we gave 100 of them to the Great Northern Railway Historical Association, again, as a fundraiser. So what you're buying here is actually a book that's owned by the Maple Valley Maple Valley Historical Society. They're $20 a piece, 134 pages, and about 160 photos. Now, interestingly enough, we've got about 800 photos in our collection of the Pacific Northwest Railroad, or excuse me, Pacific Coast Railroad. So we've got a whole bunch more pictures that you aren't seeing in the book, but these are some of the most appropriate ones to describe the railroad. So if you want to come up, Kurt will be happy to sign. He's gonna, why don't you just work on that table and we'll just come up here. They're $20, I accept cash, check, but not money orders.